Let me ask you something dead serious. You think you know Kendrick Lamar? You think you've figured him out through a few interviews, some award show speeches, and a playlist you run on repeat? You think streaming Good Kid, m.A.A.d 300 times gave you a front row seat to the actual truth? No. No, it didn't. Because the version of Kendrick Lamar that the world celebrates, the Grammy-stacked, Pulitzer Prize-winning, Super Bowl headlining genius, is only the surface. And underneath that surface is a story so raw, so dangerous, and so brutally real that most people in mainstream media have been quietly, deliberately, and consistently looking the other way. Today, that changes. What you're about to hear isn't a fan breakdown. This isn't a top 10 facts about Kendrick listicle dressed up in a YouTube thumbnail. This is the story that people who actually grew up around him have been trying to tell for years. People who were there. People who saw it with their own eyes. People who bled in those same streets, went to prison behind those same corners, and watched Kendrick make choices, both dark and extraordinary, that shaped every single word he's ever rapped. This is the Compton testimony. And if you're not ready to have your entire understanding of who Kendrick Lamar really is completely shattered and rebuilt from the ground up, then you should probably click away right now. But you won't. Because deep down, you already know the story goes somewhere nobody prepared you for. If you're new here and you want content that actually digs past the surface, go ahead and subscribe right now. We don't do fluff here. Hit that button and let's get into it. Here's the version of the story that got packaged and sold to the world. Kendrick Lamar, born in Compton, surrounded by violence, but somehow, miraculously, the one kid who stayed clean. The good kid. The one who kept his nose in notebooks while everyone else spiraled. The quiet poet who saw the chaos around him but never really touched it. That's the brand. That's the narrative they polished up, put a bow on, and handed to journalists and media outlets who ran with it without asking a single hard question. And here's the problem with that story. It's only half true. And a half-truth, when it's used to build someone's entire mythology, is one of the most misleading things in the world. The phrase, Good Kid, m.A.A.d, the very title of his most celebrated album, has been reduced to a metaphor for Kendrick specifically. Like he was this untouchable island of goodness surrounded by a sea of madness. But that's not what that phrase means. Not even close. That phrase was never just about him. It was about every single kid who grew up in Compton. Every child shaped and scarred and molded by that environment. Good kids, plural. Mad City, singular. Because the city didn't pick favorites. The madness didn't knock on certain doors and skip others. It seeped through every wall, every school, every park, every family dinner that got interrupted by the sound of gunshots outside. Kendrick himself has said it in his own words. He put out the positive, but he didn't yet let people understand the negatives he went through to get there. Think about that. He built an entire legendary career on the edited version of himself. And now, piece by piece, through the voices of the people who were actually there, the real story is finally coming out. Let's set the scene properly, because understanding where Kendrick came from is everything. His father wasn't always a Compton man. His father was from the streets in a completely different city, and Kendrick's mother essentially gave him an ultimatum: get out of that life, or lose her. So his father made the move. He relocated the family to Compton, California, believing a fresh start was possible. Believing he could outrun the gravitational pull of street life by changing zip codes. What he didn't anticipate was that Compton had its own gravity, its own rules, its own war. The city his father chose as an escape was, in terms of violence and gang culture, just as dangerous, some would argue even more deeply entrenched, than where they came from. And so Kendrick Lamar grew up in that. Not on the edges of it. Not watching from a safe distance through a window. He grew up inside it. Surrounded by it on every side. By the time he was 8 years old, he had already witnessed 2 murders. 8 years old. Let that land for a second. Most 8-year-olds are worried about video games and school lunches. Kendrick was already carrying the weight of watching human life end violently right in front of him. That kind of exposure doesn't just leave a mark on a child, it rewires them. It changes how they process threat, safety, loyalty, and survival. Everything after that moment gets filtered through a lens that most people never have to look through. And as the years passed, the streets didn't get further away. They got closer. This is the part of the story that gets deliberately softened whenever Kendrick comes up in mainstream conversations. People love the narrative of the artist who escaped the hood. What they don't want to sit with is the reality of who that artist was before the escape. Kendrick wasn't just observing gang culture. He was in it. He was banging the set. He was out in those streets with his friends committing petty crimes, serious crimes, fighting, smoking, drinking. This wasn't acting. This wasn't research for an album. This was his life. And the people who grew up beside him will tell you straight, Kendrick was just a regular hood kid who happened to have a talent most people didn't see coming. The talent didn't make him special in the streets. It made him a target for expectations he wasn't even sure he could meet. Think about what it means to grow up in a neighborhood where being affiliated isn't really a choice, it's a survival mechanism. It's geography. It's family structure. When everyone around you is from the same set, and those people are your brothers, your neighbors, your protectors, the question isn't, should I get involved? The question is, can I afford not to? And for years, Kendrick's answer was the same as everybody else's. His father saw it happening. He watched his son gravitating toward the same life he himself had tried to leave behind. And he did what any father who genuinely loves his child does. He sat him down and told him the truth about his own mistakes. He said it plainly, I don't want you to be like me. He shared the failures, the consequences, the regrets. He tried to redirect the trajectory before it was too late. But here's the brutal reality that every parent who's tried this already knows. Wisdom shared too early doesn't always land. The streets have a louder voice than a parent's kitchen table conversation. Because the streets are right there, every day, with your friends, your community, the only world that feels real. His father gave him the map. But Kendrick still had to walk the road himself before he could understand why the map mattered. Now let's talk about the people who were actually there. Because this is where the story stops being abstract and starts being devastating. Lil L, Kendrick's best friend since elementary school. These two were inseparable coming up, the kind of friendship that forms when you're both just trying to survive the same impossible environment. L became known beyond their neighborhood after appearing in a documentary about Compton. And his story is everything that Kendrick's story could have been without the circumstances that tilted their fates in different directions. L went in and out of jail starting as a teenager. His mother battled addiction to crack cocaine during his earliest years, leaving him dependent on whoever in the community would step up. No stable home base. No anchor. Just the streets and the people in them. Jason Katon. Another one. Lost his mother in the sixth grade, and by the time he was 14 years old, he was fully embedded in the West Side Piru gang. In 2007, Jason was handed a 21-year prison sentence. Before he went in, he did something that tells you everything about the kind of person he was underneath the street life. He asked Kendrick to look after his younger brother, Chad. He trusted Kendrick with the most important thing he had left in the world. Chad was killed in a drive-by shooting in 2013. Sit with that. Jason is in prison. He can't protect his own brother. He's carrying guilt so heavy it could crush a man because he was the one who introduced Chad to the gang lifestyle in the first place. And Kendrick is on the outside, carrying his own guilt because he made a promise he couldn't keep. There are songs on Kendrick's albums that hit differently when you understand they aren't metaphors. They're reports from a crime scene. They are witness testimony. When Kendrick raps about guilt and loss and the weight of surviving when others didn't, he is not performing emotion. He is remembering specific names, specific faces, specific moments that no amount of success will ever fully erase. J-Man. Another childhood friend, sentenced to 25 years in prison. The guy had no mother, no father during those formative years. Just the hood. Just the structure that gang life provides when family structure collapses. And Gweed, Kendrick's big homie, shot in the head and then imprisoned for 11 years on top of it. Key Riches, another one from the neighborhood, killed. These aren't statistics. These are the people Kendrick grew up laughing with, ate with, rode bikes with, made memories with. And one by one, the streets collected them. Here's a story that doesn't get told enough. And when you hear it, you'll understand exactly how thin the line was between Kendrick Lamar becoming one of the greatest rappers in history and becoming another name on a list that nobody outside Compton ever hears. Kendrick had a session at the studio. He called Lil L, tried to get him to come through. L said no. Said he had to go handle something. He had to put in work. Business. Hood business. You know what that means. Kendrick went to the studio. A few hours later, L was arrested. And Kendrick sat there, in a studio, surrounded by microphones and music, and realized that if he hadn't had that session, if he hadn't had that specific reason to be somewhere else that night, he would have been right there next to L, doing the same thing, getting the same charge, getting processed into the same system that swallowed so many of his friends. He would have been gone. Not dead, but gone. Another talented kid buried inside a prison sentence before the world ever got to hear a single bar. That moment broke something open in Kendrick. Not immediately. Not dramatically in a single flash of revelation. But it planted a seed. The realization that the difference between his path and L's path on that particular night wasn't character. Wasn't intelligence. Wasn't values. It was a studio session. It was timing. It was the thinnest possible thread. And that terrified him in a way that changed how he saw everything. In a 2011 interview, Kendrick admitted openly that he came close to prison himself. That he'd been arrested. That police encounters were a regular feature of his teenage life, not an anomaly. He knows exactly what that version of his future looked like. And that knowledge, that visceral, personal knowledge of how close the edge really was, is what makes his music different from almost every artist claiming street credibility today. Let's stop here for a second. Because there's something happening in hip-hop right now that needs to be called out directly, and it connects deeply to everything we've been discussing about Kendrick's background. There are rappers, signed rappers, popular rappers, rappers with management teams and PR firms, who have built entire careers around the language and imagery of street life they never actually experienced. They attach themselves to trauma they didn't live. They glorify consequences they never faced. They perform a version of hood identity that the people who actually came from those hoods have to watch from the outside, shaking their heads, because nothing about it is real. And then they have the audacity, the absolute nerve, to question the authenticity of someone like Kendrick Lamar. Someone whose childhood friends are in prison right now. Someone who stood over the body of a friend who took his last breath at 15 years old and was specifically requested, to make sure that story got told. Someone who has carried survivor's guilt so heavy that it shows up in his music even when he's trying to hide it. You know why Kendrick doesn't come out and defend himself every time some clout-chasing rapper takes a shot? Because there's a code. There's a street code that says people who are actually about something don't need to perform their credentials for an audience. You move in silence. You let your reality speak without a press release. And when you come from where Kendrick comes from, when your childhood friends are the receipts, you don't need to explain yourself to people who grew up in suburbs trying to cosplay as something they've only seen in music videos. The people doing the questioning are the ones who should be questioned. Because when you've never had to worry about which car is slowing down on your street before you walk out your front door, and you've never had to watch someone get jumped while trying to buy a t-shirt, and you've never had a conversation with a friend who asked you to tell their story before they died, then maybe, just maybe, you're not qualified to determine who is or isn't the real thing. Yo, if this is hitting different for you right now, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. We're going deeper and I need you locked in for what's coming next. Kendrick's creative partner and co-founder of PG Lang, Dave Free, gave an interview in 2022 where he pulled back the curtain just slightly on a side of Kendrick that the public almost never sees. He described witnessing Kendrick's shift in real time from poet to protector. From thoughtful artist to someone who would handle a threat to himself or his family without hesitation, without ceremony, and without apology. Dave called it the hot-headed shadow self. And the reason that phrase matters so much is because it confirms what anyone paying close attention to Kendrick's actual lyrics has always understood. This man is not entirely the composed, intellectual figure the media constructed. There is a fire underneath the philosophy. There is a rawness underneath the poetry. There is someone who learned very early that the world could turn violent without warning, and who never fully unlearned the reflexes that environment installed in him. This is actually one of the most important things to understand about Kendrick's artistry. The reason his music hits harder than almost anything else in the genre is precisely because of this duality. He is genuinely two people at war with each other, the person his environment shaped him to be, and the person his talent and his father's wisdom and his own survival instincts eventually pushed him to become. Neither version cancels the other out. They coexist. They argue with each other on every album he's ever made. When he raps about forgiving the killers of his friends, that's not a bar. That's a man having a private conversation with himself out loud, over a beat, because it's the only way he knows how to process something that language alone can't hold. When he talks about the streets calling him back even after he made it, that's not nostalgia. That's honesty about how the past doesn't simply dissolve because your income bracket changed. Let's go back to Good Kid, M.A.A.d City with fresh eyes, now that we actually understand the context. Every story on that album happened. The woman confronted in the shopping center when Kendrick and his friends were deep in depression after losing someone real. The drinking, the smoking, the getting laced on something he didn't know was in what he smoked real. The fighting, the close calls, the moments of standing at a crossroads between two completely different versions of his future real. His close friend Kanon, the guy he started rapping with before either of them had any idea what their lives would become, has confirmed this directly. He was there. He remembers the day they were walking together and got attacked from behind without warning. And both of them had to fight off 4 people with nothing but adrenaline and the kind of survival instinct that only develops when you've been in dangerous situations enough times that your body starts responding before your brain catches up. 2 short guys. For attackers. And they held their own. Because when your whole life has been preparing you for exactly that kind of moment, your body already knows what to do before fear has time to set in. Sing About Me, one of the most devastating songs Kendrick has ever recorded, is a direct documentary. Not a creative interpretation. Not an artistic representation of a hypothetical. His partner told him, in real life, with real breath in his lungs that wouldn't be there much longer, to make sure that story got told. To make sure his existence was documented. To make sure someone remembered that he was here. And then his partner died. Stomped out at 15 years old. And Kendrick went into a studio and kept his promise. How many rappers can you name who are keeping deathbed promises to childhood friends in their music? That's not performance. That's obligation. That's love expressed in the only language Kendrick knows well enough to trust. Here's where we have to zoom out for a minute. Because Kendrick's story, and the stories of everyone around him, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen because some people made bad choices and some people made good ones. The environment that produced this level of concentrated devastation was not an accident. The neighborhoods in Compton, and in cities like it across America, were the product of decades of deliberate policy, redlining, systematic disinvestment, the flooding of communities with substances that were simultaneously criminalized and then used to justify mass incarceration. A system was constructed, brick by brick, that made it incredibly difficult to get out and devastatingly easy to get trapped. And that system still runs. It's running right now. In every neighborhood where a kid grows up watching the same patterns repeat across generations and starts wondering if the pattern is actually the point. When Lil L got out of prison in 2019, one of the things celebrated, genuinely, joyfully celebrated, was that he got a passport for the first time in his life. To people who grew up in stable circumstances, that sounds like a small thing. A basic thing. Why would you celebrate that? Because getting a passport means you have documentation, clean enough records, financial stability, and forward-looking ambition all aligned at the same moment. For someone who's spent years of their adult life incarcerated, whose credit is damaged, whose records are marked, whose access to opportunity has been repeatedly and systematically blocked, getting a passport is a declaration of freedom. It's saying, the walls that held me are no longer walls. The world is available to me now. That's worth celebrating. That's worth putting on a stage in front of millions of people and acknowledging with pride. This is the part of the story that deserves way more attention than it gets. Because it's easy to talk about where someone came from. It's easy to be fascinated by the darkness and the struggle and the survival narrative. What's harder to cover, what requires actually paying attention over a long period of time, is what someone does with their position once they've made it. Kendrick made it. And he went back. While Jason Katon was incarcerated, he didn't sit in a cell feeling forgotten. He went to school. He earned a degree behind bars. He wrote 2 books. And Kendrick, using his platform, his audience, his reach, promoted those books while performing on Saturday Night Live. One of the most watched comedy and music stages in American television. He used that moment not just for himself. He used it as a microphone for someone who couldn't be in the room. Lil L works at PG Lang, Kendrick, and Dave Free's company. He's not just employed there casually. He's being put through executive education. There is a position waiting for him at the end of that program. Not a favor. Not charity. A career path built and held open specifically because someone with the means to do that decided it mattered. Ducky, who just finished a decade-long prison sentence. J-Man's little brother, Hitter, who most recently got placed on G-Nex. Friends whose names appear in Kendrick's songs and music videos, who are being quietly, consistently, deliberately supported not just with money, but with structure, access, and genuine opportunity. This is what real community investment looks like. Not a charity donation for a tax write-off. Not a celebrity appearance at a foundation event for the press photos. Actual, personal, ongoing commitment to the people who were there when nobody else was watching. The people who were part of the story before there was an audience for the story. And the reason Kendrick does this with as little fanfare as possible, the reason most of this comes out only through interviews and small moments rather than press releases, is because where he comes from, that's just what you do. You look out for your people. You don't announce it. You don't build a brand around it. You just do it. Let's have a real conversation about what separates Kendrick Lamar from most of what dominates rap charts right now. Because the contrast is so stark it borders on uncomfortable. There is an entire generation of rappers whose entire artistic output consists of approximately 3 topics: what they'll do to their enemies, what they've acquired materially, and vague gestures toward a street credibility they can't actually substantiate. That's it. No narrative. No introspection. No attempt to engage with the actual human complexity of the world they claim to represent. Just aggression, materialism, and performance. And the tragedy isn't just that this music is shallow. The tragedy is that it actively harms the communities it claims to represent. When young kids in struggling neighborhoods grow up consuming content that glorifies the exact patterns destroying those neighborhoods, the incarceration, the violence, the short-term thinking, they're being handed a prison by someone getting rich on the other side of the bars. Kendrick understood this from the beginning. He said it clearly. He could have come out of Compton rapping about everything he did and saw and participated in without context, without consequence, without accountability. He had that content. He lived that life. He was there. But he made a different choice. He decided to bring something deeper. To talk about the reasons behind the destruction, the systems producing it, and the paths, however narrow, that lead away from it. That's not just artistic superiority. That's moral clarity operating under enormous cultural pressure. Because the market rewards the other thing. The market loves the performance. The market will pay handsomely for 2 minutes of bragging over a trap beat. Choosing to do something more complex, more honest, more uncomfortable, and doing it well enough to still reach millions of people, that's a different kind of achievement entirely. There's a specific kind of weight that survivors carry. People who come from dangerous environments and manage to escape, whether through talent, timing, luck, or some combination of all 3, often spend years wrestling with a guilt that doesn't have a clean resolution. Because making it out doesn't feel entirely like victory when the people you grew up with are still inside. When they're in cells or in the ground. When every year of your success is shadowed by the awareness that the only difference between your path and theirs might have been a studio session on one particular night. Kendrick has been living with that weight since his early 20s. And rather than let it either destroy him or harden him into indifference, he channeled it into the most productive force he could find. He made it into music. He made it into testimony. He made it into evidence, not of how terrible the streets are, because everyone already knows that, but of how complex and layered and fully human the people living in those streets are. The mother at a funeral who calls her son a good kid even though the newspapers ran stories about the chaos he caused, she's not lying. She's remembering the version of him that existed before the environment got its hands on him. She's paying tribute to who he was before the m.A.A.d city did its work. That's not denial. That's the only act of dignity available to her in that moment. And understanding that distinction between who someone was and what they became under pressure is the difference between journalism and wisdom. Kendrick has been trying to give us that wisdom for over a decade. And it took people who were actually there beside him to help us understand just how hard-won that wisdom really was. When you step back and look at the full picture, not just the music, not just the awards, not just the cultural milestones, what you see is something genuinely rare. A person who came from a place designed to consume people, who was consumed by it for a while, who got pulled back by timing and love and a father's desperate honesty, and who then spent the next decade and a half using every tool available to him to document, process, challenge, and ultimately transform that experience into something that outlasts him. This is not just an artist's story. This is a community story. The album was never just about Kendrick. The Pulitzer wasn't just for Kendrick. Every time Kendrick performs and drops Lil L's name or Jason's name or Key Rich's name into the conversation, he's making sure those people exist in the historical record. He's making sure that Compton isn't just a place that gets mentioned in the backdrop of a success story. He's making sure the people who didn't get out are given the complexity and dignity they deserved, but didn't always receive while they were alive or before the system took them. The odds stacked against people from environments like his are not accidental. They are structural. They are deliberate. And the only way to fight a structural problem is with structural solutions, which is exactly what Kendrick is doing at PG Lang, with every person he employs, every degree he funds, every door he holds open for someone whose record would otherwise keep it closed. The world gives you flowers when you win. Kendrick gives flowers to people the world forgot. That difference tells you everything you need to know. Bell, if you've made it this far, you already know what's going on here. Hit subscribe. Hit like. Leave a comment with the name of one person from your own city who deserved better than they got. Let's honor them down there. There was a woman. A stranger. In a shopping center. At a moment when Kendrick and his friends were drowning in grief after losing someone close. Not a family member. Not a counselor. Just a woman who stopped, looked at these young men, and said something that cracked through all of the armor they'd built. We don't know exactly what she said, but we know what it did. For Kendrick, it became the turning point. The moment he looked around at where he was, who he was with, what his trajectory was pointing toward, and decided something had to change. Not because he suddenly became a different person, but because something in that interaction reflected back to him a possibility he hadn't been letting himself see. He's talked about how he was drinking heavily during that period. Smoking regularly. Running in the same circles, doing the same things, gradually becoming indistinguishable from the path that was slowly swallowing all of his friends one by one. And then the stranger in a shopping center said something, and the needle moved. This is important to understand because it removes the mythology from the transformation. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It wasn't a moment of divine inspiration where everything suddenly became clear and the artist stepped forward fully formed. It was a woman in a shopping center. It was a studio session that kept him from a felony. It was a father's warnings finally finding their way through years of noise. It was watching friend after friend disappear into a system that doesn't give back what it takes. The transformation was slow, cumulative, and built on 1,000 small moments over several years. And understanding that is actually more inspiring than the myth, because it's reproducible. It's not reserved for geniuses or chosen ones. It's available to anyone who lives long enough to accumulate enough moments of almost too late clarity. So, let's put this to rest. Once and for all. For everyone who has ever questioned where Kendrick Lamar really comes from, what he's really seen, what he's really done, or whether his credibility is constructed or earned, here it is. He was there. He was in it. He banged the set. He committed crimes. He smoked, drank, fought, and ran with people whose lives the system was already marking for destruction. He lost friends to bullets and prison sentences before he was old enough to vote. He watched a childhood friend take his last breath at 15 years old and then went into a studio and kept a deathbed promise on wax. He had his own arrests, his own close calls, his own moments of looking at the backseat of a police car and understanding, truly understanding, that this was the fork in the road. The difference between Kendrick Lamar the legend and Kendrick Lamar the cautionary tale is heartbreakingly thin. It was a father who had enough self-awareness to be honest about his own failures. A studio session on the right night. A stranger in a shopping center. And a talent so profound that eventually, even the streets recognized it and gave him something very few people in that world ever receive: permission to leave. He took that permission and turned it into a body of work that will be studied, argued about, and felt in people's bones for generations. He took the names of people the world was never going to remember and embedded them permanently in the music. He built a company that is actively pulling people from the margins into opportunity. And he did all of it without losing the thread, without ever pretending that he's something he isn't, or that where he came from is anything other than exactly what it was. That's not a good kid who survived a mad city. That's a person forged by a mad city who chose, over and over again, through incredible difficulty and against enormous odds, to use what it made him for something more than it intended. There's a whole world outside of the block you grew up on. There's a passport that's waiting for you to apply for it. There's a degree with your name on it. There's an executive position that exists beyond the version of yourself your neighborhood decided you were going to be. These are things that people who didn't grow up with the odds stacked against them take completely for granted, and these are the things that people from places like Compton have to fight tooth and nail, system by system, obstacle by obstacle, just to access. Kendrick celebrating Lil L getting a passport isn't small. It's enormous. It's everything. It's evidence that the story doesn't have to end where it looks like it's going to end. That the trajectory installed by circumstance is not the final answer. That with the right support, the right opportunity, and someone willing to hold a door open long enough for you to walk through it, the ending can be completely different from the one that was written for you without your consent. Our people have been deprived. Systematically. Historically. Continuously. There are traps built into every step of the ladder, and they're not accidental, and the people who built them knew exactly what they were doing. But the trap only works if you stop moving. The system only wins if you stop pushing. And the story of Kendrick Lamar, the full story, not the Grammy reel, not the headlines, but this story is proof that pushing is possible. That it costs something enormous. That not everyone makes it. But that it is possible. Do it for the ones who didn't make it out. Do it for the ones still inside, getting degrees behind bars, writing books that deserve to be read, holding on to the belief that someone on the outside still sees them. Do it for the 15-year-olds who made someone promise to sing about them before it was too late. Do it because the world they deserved existed. It just never found them in time. And if you're out there right now, watching this, feeling the weight of where you come from pressing down on you, know this. The weight is real. The obstacles are real. The system is real. But so are you. And so is the path. Even when you can't see it. Even when it looks like everyone around you is being pulled under. The path is there. Kendrick found it. And he's been dropping directions in every bar he's ever written. You just have to be willing to listen past the performance and hear what he's actually saying. Before you click away, I need you to do one thing. If this video hit you the way I meant it to hit you, if you learned something real today, if this gave you a new lens for understanding not just Kendrick Lamar, but the entire conversation around who deserves respect, who's authentic, and what it actually costs to climb out of the bottom, subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We don't do surface. We don't do shortcuts. We go all the way into the story, every single time. Hit subscribe. Hit like. Drop a comment and tell me what's the one thing from Kendrick's story that hit you hardest today. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next video, where we keep going deeper. Big respect. Stay up. Stay pushing. And as always, gone, y'all.